Video on what I think is one of the most important features of Cubase, and it's a feature that's been around forever, and I'm really quite shocked that many other programs haven't imitated this, and that is the drum editor. So in this video I'm going to show you some of the features of the drum editor, what makes it so great. So especially if you're new to it, some of the editing tips that you can use while you're working with it to get things done really quickly. I'm also going to show you why it's so great compared to using just the regular MIDI editor that is common in so many other applications. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about the drum parts themselves and some basic drum beats at the end of the video. So stick around for that. I'll put chapters in the bottom. So why do I think the drum editor is such a fantastic tool? Well, let me just really quickly put a drum beat in and I'll show you exactly why. Okay, so here's a basic drum beat, and you can see the notes that I played. I've got kick drum here, snare drum here, hi-hat here, and open hi-hat here. So the thing you'll find with the drum editor, of course, is that you're going to have the option to name things over on the left-hand side. But the big thing for me is having the ability to adjust individual velocities of these drum hits. So here I could select all the hi-hats and do some stuff like this, but it gets pretty clunky when I want to adjust the velocity of, say, just this snare drum hit and not hit the hi-hat at the same time. Is you go over to the inspector. This is the way I like to do it. You turn on this thing called GM map, and that's just going to give you a very basic drum list over on the left-hand side, which may or may not apply to the drum hits that you have, but it's a good starting point. And now you can see I've got kick drum up top, snare drum, and hi-hat here on the bottom. And if I want to adjust the snare, all I have to do is click on the snare, and now I can see the velocity down below. If I wanted to adjust the bass drum, I could do the same thing there. And if I go and mouse over this and change the velocity, I'm only adjusting the velocity of the bass drum, not of the hi-hat that's hitting at almost the same time there. So this feature to me is invaluable. It also is just a really easy way to work, and working with the drumstick tool in the drum editor is a really nice thing once you know some of these modifier keys. So let's just start from scratch now. I'm going to show you how you can enter in a drum beat without actually playing something. All I like to do is hold Option or Alt on a PC, and if you click and drag, you get a chunk. So now I've got a chunk here ready for my drums. And if you're doing this for the first time, you won't have a drum map. So when you double click on it, it's going to open up the key editor. If you want to get to the drum editor, all you have to do is go over to the inspector, like I said before, click where it says GM map. GM stands for General MIDI, and General MIDI was this protocol that was agreed upon probably in the 80s. And they said, okay, we're going to have at least a drum kit in a lot of synthesizers that has General MIDI compatible information on it. So you could have a Yamaha keyboard with a General MIDI patch, and you could have a Korg keyboard with a General MIDI patch, and you could write something on one and then play it on the other, and the drum sounds would cross over. So this ancient setup is actually helping us here. So as you see, if I go and click in the drum editor, I can hear each sound, which again is a reason to use the drum editor. And if I make this a little bit larger, we can see some other information. One note that I'll say right off the bat, if you are working with something like Kontakt, when you load up a drum kit in Kontakt, Kontakt is defaulting to channel 1, and you can see in the drum editor that it is defaulting to channel 10. That's also an old General MIDI thing. So if you are using a drum kit in Kontakt, like this one right here, just make sure that you go to MIDI channel and set that to A10. And if you do that, now you'll be able to use the drum editor in the same way as I'm going to show you here today. So now let's go over some of the really basic steps for entering notes into the drum editor. Once you've got that chosen over on the left-hand side of the inspector, GM map, you can now go in here and see what you've got for drum sounds. So that is a hand clap. It rarely is an acoustic snare and an electric snare. It's usually just another acoustic snare that has a slightly different sound. So if you wanted to, you could go in there and just call this acoustic snare 2. And once you've done some drum maps for yourself, you can then go and save those and load them next time you open up, say, a Groove Agent kit or something like that. I gotta admit, I'm kind of lazy with it, and I don't worry too much about naming. I just kind of go by what I hear. But if you want to get that picky, you really can. So once we're happy with our names, the best way to enter information in here by hand is using the drumstick tool, which is slightly different than the pencil that you would have in the key editor. And with the drumstick tool, all you have to do is click and drop a note in. If you click and drag, you will get a whole bunch of notes that are all defined by the grid that you've got it set up on. Right now, our grid is set up at a 16th note. if I set the grid to an eighth note and undo what I've just entered in, now I'm entering in eighth notes. So let's hear what that sounds like. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and you can also use the drumstick tool to get rid of notes. So all I have to do is click on a note to get rid of it and enter another one on the side stick. I can go to my hi-hats and say I want eighth note hi-hats all the way across. So as for a couple of editing tips when you're using the drumstick tool, I can click and erase just by clicking and dragging. I can drop a whole bunch of them in all at once. I can click one note, and if I hold it down and continue to hold it down and lower, I get a lower velocity. And watch what happens if I drag a whole bunch of notes in and don't let go of the mouse. Now I get all of them changing, so I can say, okay, let's put some hi-hats in, and then let's have them all down about here. And you're done. It's pretty sweet. By the way, this little icon, this note insert velocity, determines what the default value is when you click a note in every time you use the drumstick tool. So if I actually want this to be a little closer to full volume, which is 127, I could say have this at like 118, 117, something like that. And now all of the things that I enter in are going to be at that 117 velocity level right there. So let's just erase all of that by using the arrow tool and then right click to get back to the drumstick tool. And then as far as using the modifier keys, there's a couple interesting ones here. If I just click and drag, then I'm going to draw a bunch of notes in. If I hold shift and click a note in, watch what happens when I drag it over. It lets me move it over and doesn't draw a whole bunch in. So that would be kind of useful. And you can also hold command if you're on a Mac or control on a PC. You can see that the cursor no longer snaps to this eighth note grid that I've got. If I hold command down, you can see now I can drop in a note wherever I want. And then also don't forget when you're entering things in like hi-hat, all I have to do is click and drag. I get my eighth note hi-hats. And then if I select all of these notes in the editor, watch what happens if I mouse over my MIDI information. I can go to this top left corner, drag this down, and now all of my MIDI information for this hi-hat is going to fade in over this one bar. I can do the same thing on a fade out. Just take it like this. I can also go to the middle and scale this velocity up and down. And if I had different velocities down here, I can now select all of those notes and watch what happens if I mouse over the middle. Drag it down and you see the velocity scales relative to where the other hits are. So if I go keep pushing that up, now everything goes right to the top. If I push it all the way down, eventually everything goes to the bottom. So I will often do this. If I have some variation and I don't want it anymore, I'll just select the notes, crank it all the way up to the top, and then drag it down perfectly so that they're all exactly the same. It's a little faster than drawing a line across. Advanced hot tip for you. What if you draw your hi-hats in and you want some variation? Let's say you're doing 16th notes. Let's set this to 16ths. Hold Option. And by the way, holding Option when you don't have the drumstick tool turns it into the drumstick tool. So if you're just on the arrow tool, just go like that. And now we get our notes drawn in. And I can quickly draw a box around them, right? Select them and stuff. So a lot of times I don't even switch to the drumstick tool. I just keep it on the arrow tool. Anyways, that's only when you're on the arrow tool. And so now what if I want some variation? So every other note is lower in velocity. Just so happens there's something called this Project Logical Editor, which is like really advanced stuff. And it has all of these custom functions that you might perform on information sort of programmed in, like it's real programmer heavy kind of stuff. And what we can do is just go up to the key commands. So I'm going to go edit key commands. We're going to go to Project Logical Preset right here, and we can see all sorts of crazy stuff that you can do to information, like delete every fifth note. Not sure how that would be useful, but hey, it's a thing you can do. Delete muted events. So what if you have a whole bunch of things muted and you just want to get rid of those muted events? Boom, do that one command and off it goes. I'm going to go to the very last one, which is velocity minus 10% for each second note. And I'm going to click on it and I'm going to type in some keys that I know aren't assigned to anything else. I'm just going to go Command Option V for velocity. And I'm going to assign that now to this logical preset. So watch what happens now. I go to my MIDI information, Command Option V, press that a couple of times, and now I've just got alternating velocities on hi-hats. Isn't that awesome? That little hit wasn't great, but here it is again. I just realized my slider camera must have shifted early in the video. That's better. Okay, so now what we'll do is go over drum basics. So some really elemental stuff for beginners, and then we'll talk just a little bit about some basic drum beats to get you started. So let's look at this Groove Agent kit right here, just talk about the kit. We've got the kick drum or the bass drum. It's got this pedal and a mallet that hits the drum. We've got a snare drum, which is this really interesting drum that has this metal chain on the bottom, and that's called the snare. And that tightens up against the bottom of the drum and gives it this kind of sparkly sound. Anyways, that's the snare drum and the kick drum. Those are the two most important parts of the drum set. The bass drum and the snare drum goes way back to orchestral music before the drum set, and we're talking about those big bass drums with the mallet and then the snare drum that a snare drummer would play by itself. And then before that, to me, it feels like the drums, the snare, and the kick themselves are going back to some part of music making that existed before we even had instruments, where people would just do stomping and clapping. And if you think about the most basic drum beats, they really are this back and forth between a stomp and a clap. And the best thing to remember when you're starting this is to put the kick drum or the bass drum on 1 and 3 and snare on 2 and 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So putting bass drum on 1 and 3 and snare on 2 and 4 is not something you have to do, of course. This is just a good starting point for certain styles of music, and it's a very common thing. And then what I'll do for the hi-hats is put them on 8th notes, like this. So what does this sound like? A little bit of Billie Jean, right? And if we want to make this have a little bit more variation, select the notes and then just go Command Option V, my new key command for reducing the velocity of every other hit. Now let's have a listen to it. And if you decided, you know what, I actually want it to go the other way. I want the velocity to be quieter on the hits, on the beats, and not on those offbeats. Well, grab that first note, delete it, and then move these first ones over. And then draw yourself a new one in. Now we've got the opposite thing happening, right? You see how some subtle variation like that all of a sudden makes this drum beat kind of more interesting. So there is your most basic drum beat. And what else did I add in there? We've got a hi-hat. What is the hi-hat? It's this one right here. And with the hi-hat, you've got these two cymbals that are opening and closing. And you're using your foot for that. So you've got a foot that closes, and we have something called pedal hi-hat every time you close the hi-hat. So if I click on pedal hi-hat, you hear this little thing that's happening. And what that means is jazz drummers especially use it a lot because they can keep time with the pedal hi-hat and then use their hands to do other things like toms and drum fills and other cymbals. And then we've got open hi-hat where you actually lift your foot right off the pedal and it stays open, rings out until it dies out. And usually what ends up happening is the drummer will close it. The other drums that we've got, of course, are the high toms, mid tom, and then the low tom and the floor tom. Crash cymbals, a splash cymbal, and then we've got a regular cymbal, and then we've got Chinese cymbal or China cymbal, and then the ride cymbal. And the ride cymbal is often the one that jazz drummers will use, and it's also the one that rock drummers will use on the chorus of songs. So you could switch from something like this hi-hat here to something like a ride cymbal. So all you would do on your chorus is maybe Option drag this chunk, double click on it, and take your hi-hats and drag them over to the ride cymbal. So where is the ride cymbal? We can see it way down here. Watch this, we can just arrow down. And now we've got the ride cymbal. Another thing about the ride cymbal is if you play the ride cymbal towards the middle of the cymbal, you're going to be hitting the ride bell, and that sounds like this. That's this middle part of the ride cymbal right here. And if you hit it on that one, it's louder and it's brighter and it's more intense. So sometimes what the drummers will do is take hits like this and move them over to the bell. So now we've got the ride cymbal and then the bell. So let's select these and increase the velocity of those so we can hear them a little bit louder. So another tip for programming your drums when you want to do something, make something a little bit more interesting. Let's say you've got 4 bars of a verse and then you're into your chorus. What I would often do is duplicate my verse drum beat and then put a little drum fill right before the chorus. So we've got this thing right here. Let's set our grid to 16th notes and start playing around with this. We're going to go a snare, kick, and then we'll take this one up to some toms. We'll take it up to a high tom and then a low tom right here. And by the way, if I don't have the drumstick, all I have to do is double click. And actually, let's take that to, and double click to erase, and then more high toms right here. And then another floor tom right here. Here we go. What can we do to this drum beat to make it more interesting? Well, right now I've got my grid set to 16th notes, so that's a really good place to start. I'm going to put a little bass drum here right before the snare, and we'll see what that sounds like. That sounds good. We can also do maybe in the middle of a bar. You don't always have to have the kick drum coming on 1 and 3. So let's get rid of that one and do something like this. Maybe we can make the hi-hats do a little bit of t-t. And then you could do something like every other bar, or maybe every bar if you want to. You can go over to the open hi-hat. So if we go over to the open hi-hat right here, grab this one and just move it to our open hi-hat. Let's hear what that sounds like. Just going through and starting to move your kick drum around is going to get you some different results. And the more you play around with this and start to listen to other music, you're going to go, okay, now I'm starting to hear what drummers are doing in the songs that you listen to. So this kind of drum beat definitely works for rock stuff. Could work for, you know, a little bit funkier stuff as well. And we're going to talk about swing in a second. One more thing that you could do is go to a 16th note pattern. So that was mostly 8th notes. So now I'm going to go to the drumstick tool and we're going to enter in 16ths. Let's select them all and do Command Option V, our key command for reducing the velocity of every other note, and then press play. And some more editing tips. You know, let's say all 4 hits have kind of different velocities, maybe something like this, alternating. Watch this, I can select just those 4 and go Command D, and now that just goes all the way through. Maybe do a kick drum after a snare drum. One thing I would recommend is having your bass guitar or your bass instrument or your bass synth locking to what your bass drum is doing. It would be something like this. So I do that kind of stuff all the time, whether it's rock music, whether it's hip hop stuff. You know, it's just something that bass players and drummers often do. They don't have to do it all the time, but it's just a really good tip. So back to drums, let's just look at this little drum beat here and see how we could make something like this a little bit more in the hip hop genre. Okay, so I've got a hip hop kit loaded up here in Groove Agent. So we're at about 70 beats per minute. I have a little chunk here and I've chosen the GM map over on the left-hand side. And I'm going to set my grid here to 8th notes to start. And we're just going to find a hi-hat. So we can hear that this one has very different sounds than it says. And there's our hi-hats. So we're going to call this hi-hat 1 and hi-hat 2 and hi-hat 3. Okay, so now we've also got bass drum. And I like that little snare there. So I'm just going to go between these bass drum, that bass drum and that snare drum right there. And we're going to start with some hi-hats. And I'm going to put them on 8th notes. And then we're going to put our grid to 16th notes. And we're going to drop in a kick drum, put a snare drum on 2 and 4. So these kind of clicky snare drums. And then we're going to put kick drum right before that. And we're going to do something like this. There we go. So we've got a kick drum on 1, and then a 16th right before the snare or beat 2, and then another kick drum between beats 3 and 4, and then another kick drum right after. It's kind of playing around with where the kick placement is, kind of like I was showing you before, but we're going to listen to this and see if this sounds right. And it's not bad. It could be used in some hip hop, but we would call this beat straight, where everything is lining up perfectly with the grid and nothing is swung. And swing happens when you take every other hit at a certain measurement and make it late. So you actually delay it a little bit. And so if we wanted to add some swing to this, we're going to hear the swing on 16th notes. And right now my hi-hats are at 8th notes. So to make this really obvious, I'm going to draw in hi-hats at 16th notes. There we go. Maybe I'll go Command Option V and reduce every other one. Okay, so in order to get this thing changed to we need to add some swing. You actually have to go to this editor, this quantize editor, if you're doing this for the first time, and you can see in here how we can swing things. So we've got 16ths, I've got my swing at 0%, and so what I need to do is crank up the amount of swing that I want in this beat. If I set my swing to 100%, you're going to see every other line here move way over. So watch what happens. I press swing at 100%. Now we can see that other line moved over, and then this one's on the offbeat, and then this one moves over, and then this one's on the offbeat, because we're on 16th, so it's swinging every other 16th note. To hear what that sounds like, we just hit the quantize button, and now we can see we've got our hi-hats have just been swung. My bass drums have not been swung because they weren't selected. So all I'd have to do there is select them as well, and then just hit quantize, and you can see them move over. And the beautiful thing about Cubase and quantizing is that it shows you on the grid where the quantize is. I don't know why more programs don't do this. Now let's have a listen to that. So that's kind of got this triplet thing. As soon as you do 100% swing, you can actually fit a triplet inside there. So if you watch me tap out some triplets here. So that's why jazz musicians love it, because we can do triplet solos and stuff like that over a swung beat. And that's why hip hop's fun for jazz musicians as well, because so often the beats are swung. But a lot of times they aren't swung 100%. So if you just want a little bit of swing, we could go in there and set our swing to 50%. Let's select all of them and press quantize. And now you see them move over a little bit. We'll see what that sounds like. And here that's just got a bit of a funkier feel. And if you know you're going to always like swing at 50%, all you have to do is hit this little plus button, and it will save a preset from now on in your Cubase that'll say 16th swing at 50%. So play around with swing a little bit if this is new to you. There's your really basic hip hop drum beat, a whole bunch of basic drum editing tips, the drum editor. Hope this was useful for you, and make sure you hit that subscribe button and the bell, and I'll see you in the next video.